Welcome back to the France 24 debate. We are talking tonight about Franco-Russian relations. That's as Russian President Vladimir Putin is here in France at the Versailles Chateau alongside the French President Emmanuel Macron. The two men had talks on the sidelines of the inauguration of an exhibit marking 3 centuries of Franco-Russian diplomatic ties. Now, one of the issues that French President Emmanuel Macron said would be a big one in those talks was the situation in Ukraine. We heard from Vladimir Putin earlier today talking about sanctions against Russia, which he says are no help at all. Let's listen.
To what extent can the sanctions help stabilize the crisis in southeastern Ukraine? The answer is they can't. They can't help to find a solution. I'd like to take this opportunity to address myself to media outlets here in France and around the world. We must fight to lift sanctions in the economic sphere. It's only by doing that that we can move forward and improve the lot of people around the world.
Now, France is in a bit of a funny position here. It spearheaded those EU sanctions, of course, in Russia. And during his campaign, Emmanuel Macron pledged to deal firmly with Moscow unless it met its obligations in Ukraine. But Macron also called for de-escalation of sanctions, which he said had a negative impact on bilateral trade. So which will prevail, Dominique?
Well, I think it's a tool for negotiation, of course. It's a very important tool for Russia. They know that its sanction is a difficult point. And I guess that President Macron is using that because that's one of the leverage he's got in the negotiation. And so there will be discussion prior to, I think, in July, where the EU will meet together. It's a bit wrong to say that France is a leading country in sanction, because France has a big difficulty with the agriculture regarding Russia. And it's more people from the center of Europe, which has a different history with Russia than we have. They have been occupied by the Soviet Union for a long time, and so that's why they've got a different history. So within EU, you've got different position, and of course, if you want to convince people to leave, to lift the sanction, you've got to have something given by Russia.
And what might that be?
It's probably linked to the Minsk agreements, which it's an interesting point because for Mr. Putin, it's very interesting that the Normandy way of
which he called for again during these talks.
Exactly, he's calling that, and President Macron specifically said that he wants to continue with this format, which is very interesting because it's mainly Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, and US are not part of this discussion, so it's very important for Mr. Putin.
Molly, what are your thoughts from there about what President Putin and President Macron had to say about Ukraine?
I think that the sort of steps moving forward on Ukraine, the focus remains sort of maintaining sanctions or expanding sanctions or retracting sanctions. There was also some attention to some of President Trump's advisors' comments on this week. I think the truth is that what is happening now is fairly unclear. And if you talk to diplomats in Europe and in the United States, sort of at the working level, everybody says there's resolve, the sanctions will be maintained, they're not going to be removed until the Minsk terms are met. But at the higher levels in various places, it seems like some of these things are up for discussion. And I think the part that's concerning is it's the way that the Russians want. It is not Ukraine as Ukraine. It is Ukraine linked to Syria and to other things. And that linkage is very important to the Kremlin, to how they're trying to negotiate on Syria and on Ukraine. And I think it's something to pay attention to moving forward because that aids the Kremlin position. You've also had some pretty amazing statements from the Kremlin this week or from people sort of around the Kremlin that have gone unnoticed, including one that was essentially that if NATO or NATO-allied troops try to enter Crimea or eastern Ukraine, not just now Russian territory, but Russian-occupied territory, that they would be justified in using nuclear weapons against those forces. This is really unbelievable talk. So the line seems to be moving forward from the Kremlin side while everybody else is sort of reevaluating their positions, which is a really bad way to go into negotiations on Ukraine.
Molly, you're not here in the studio with us, but there's been some eye rolling to my left from Edouard Chanot from the Russian state news agency Sputnik. Edouard, tell us.
Well, not only on your left. Yeah, well, we're already talking about nukes or that kind of stuff. I'm a bit surprised because the main challenge in Ukraine is not Russia, it is Ukraine. It is Kiev. It is Poroshenko's government, because Poroshenko's government is not satisfied with the Minsk agreements, because the Minsk agreement pushes towards the autonomy of Donetsk and Lugansk, and currently Ukraine is bombing Donetsk and Lugansk. So that's a very good thing that actually the Ukraine is coming back at the table, because there is a conflict to be resolved, and hopefully it can be done in the midterm, in the near future.
Dominique, would you like to weigh in on that, on Ukraine?
Yes, I think that Germany and France were successful in achieving the Minsk agreements, but then you've got to apply the Minsk agreements. And obviously there are problems on the Ukraine side. There are problems also to solve on the Russian side. So they need to go back to the table, discuss that, and apply the Minsk agreement. That's it.
I would like to add about the sanction. It's not true, but that it does not work. The situation, inside situation, is terrible in Russia. You know that every week I call to my home city, it's Chelyabinsk region. People tell me that the prices are very high and no money, and with every day something happened which make their level of life worse and worse. So sanctions works, of course.
That's why it's a powerful leverage in discussion, and that's probably why President Putin talk about that, because it's important.
Yes, and in Russia we say if you tell about something, it shows that it's so.
Molly, what are your thoughts on that?
I do think that there's been an impact of sanctions in Russia. I think the question is on who, and I do think that for normal families, for the average Russian household, there probably has been an impact. There's been an increase in prices. The economic situation inside the country is not great for normal citizens. But I think at the higher level, at the elite level, at the guys around the Kremlin level, there's sort of an understanding that this is a cost of moving forward with other strategy, and they certainly don't seem to be suffering. There's still a lot of money being laundered out of Russia. Nobody is giving up their yachts anytime soon. And I think that is something that needs to pay attention to. For 25 years, and even before, there's been this constant narrative of Russian economic collapse is imminent. But the Russians sort of calculate the cost of this in different ways than we do in the West. And for sure, sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy. But their other means of diplomatic and economic outreach are helping them to get around the impact of sanctions and to do new deals with other countries and to sell a lot more weapons and to make new deals on oil and other things. And I think that that is the overall landscape is one where sanctions need to be maintained for the diplomatic signal. But in terms of whether or not this is going to have a lasting economic impact that will be meaningful to Putin, I don't think it does.
But also I would like to add about rule of propaganda, because you know that if you ask any Russian people in the street, in the usual city, they tell you that it's Europe who makes a sanction against us and against Russian citizens. They don't understand that it's a sanction against elite. They think that now we have good food because it's Europe forbidden. Bring this food in Russia.
So, and that propaganda.
And it's a propaganda, yes.
Edward, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I didn't really understand. Well, the sanctions were implemented by both, by let's say the West, by including Brussels and the EU. So, does it only target like the Russian elite? Of course not. I mean, if they wanted to target only the Russian elites, there would be other means to do so. I mean, you can ban them for coming in the EU, because many of them have houses in the EU and that kind of stuff. So no, I don't think it only targets the Russian elite. It also targets Russian people at large. I mean, it doesn't make much. It doesn't make much sense.
Let's move on now toward another thorny issue, a particularly difficult one, of course, the issue of human rights. When he was made president, Emmanuel Macron said that France will always make sure to be on the side of liberty and human rights. This meeting today was a very important test of Emmanuel Macron's commitment to reflecting human rights in France's foreign policy. Now, we heard that he did mention this to Vladimir Putin today. What does Emmanuel Macron need to do to make sure he comes through on human rights?
You know that before this meeting we had a consultation with the Fédération Internationale des Droits de l'Homme, Amnesty International, with the Conseiller de Russie, the President de France, and we received a very concrete message that the human rights issue is a very important issue for President Macron, and he will be lobby this issue with the President Putin. Of course, we don't know today which theme exactly were discussed, because we know, for example, that the rights of LGBT rights were discussed, and the President Putin, he promised to control this issue. But now it's the hot point issue, which is very important. But also there are many another issues, like I already mentioned, that civil society in Russia under huge pressure now, and my history, it's like maybe hot point of this history, because I was a leader of a little NGO from Russia, from deeper Russia, and I just defended the human rights of nuclear victims. And my NGO were accused, first of all, admitted like a foreign agent, and the propaganda channel Russia 24, they accused me in espionage, so I had escaped from the Russia with my 3 kids, because I did not want to go to prison for 20 years. And now in Russia, when many human rights NGO were liquidated, now the authority began intimidate the people who can express their opinion. For example, this search of Kirill Serebrennikov, a Russian very famous realizator, and another journalist. Yeah, and of course we expected more, but we hope that it's just inside agenda.
You were mentioning before the persecution in Chechnya for a lot of LGBT people there, with many reports. Chechen authorities allegedly rounding up dozens of men suspected of being gay. Many were tortured. At least 4 are alleged to have been killed. Now, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel raised this issue with Vladimir Putin during her visit to Russia earlier this month. Macron again says that he did it today. Let's listen now to the Vice President of Amnesty and the calls toward Vladimir Putin.
Amnesty International wants to show its solidarity with members of the LGBT community in Chechnya, who are currently the victims of terrible persecution carried out with total impunity. We want to use this opportunity of Putin's visit, hoping that Mr. Macron will follow Angela Merkel's example, who recently expressed her worry with regard to the execution and abuse of LGBT people.
Dominique?
Yes, I think during the press conference, President Macron came back on these 2 subjects, LGBT in Chechnya, but also the establishment of a forum with civil society between France and Russia. And this is where he wants to show that it's still a major important for France. So on one side, there are agreements and a roadmap on Ukraine, Syria, and on certain things like that. But still, the principle for human rights is very strong in the end of President Macron.
Molly McHugh, if you're with us, would you like to weigh in on what was said about human rights earlier at the meeting?
I do think that it was a positive signal that Macron raised it in the press conference. He didn't do it in a very heavy-handed way. He said, we discussed this behind closed doors, and I've been reassured that there will be things addressed in this sphere. I think it's a positive signal, certainly. I think that it's a broader landscape in Russia that everyone is aware of. It's almost hard to raise every issue that is of concern right now. You have many people like our other guest today who have been either driven out of the country or have chosen to leave. And this kind of demographic engineering that is underway, where whole classes of people are choosing to leave Russia, and what's left is very much a population more loyal to the Kremlin, is very troubling. And I think that the overall landscape is one worth evaluating in a more detailed way. There's a number of indicators and sort of social issues that need to be dealt with. I think one in particular is women and women's rights. There's this horrifying statistic that 40 Russian women a day are beaten to death by their domestic partners or husbands. And that's an official Russian statistic. That's not something from an NGO. And of course, the Russian response to that this year was to decriminalize domestic violence. So the overall landscape in the country in terms of individual rights and liberties needs to be looked at. This is not a model we want being exported to other countries.
Edward, would you like to respond?
Well, there's nothing much to say, but the last point, it's not about only decriminalizing, it's more complex than that, because that's true that it's a big issue, men beating their wives and that kind of stuff, but it's also because the crime was very important regarding the damage. It was the first how to say, blow or that kind of stuff. So it was better to balance the whole criminal code. Aside from that, I mean, no, nothing much to say about what has been said.
I do want to, Emmanuel Macron did bring something up about your agency today, Sputnik, and Russia Today. Throughout the campaign, he had infamously, if you like, refused accreditation. I don't know if this affected you personally, but to certain journalists from Sputnik and Russia Today following his campaign. Today, again, calling Sputnik, accusing it of being a propaganda outlet. Your response to that?
Well, this is the third time he did so. And the first time it was one of his advisors, Monsieur Ferrand, which is now known, who is now known for other problems. It's one thing to say it during a campaign. It's another thing to say it as a president. The Kremlin just disagreed with that just before I entered here. It's really disturbing. It's really disturbing because you can check it on Google. You check Emmanuel Macron, Sputnik, rumors like Mathieu Gallet, you will not find anything. Nothing. We never published anything about rumors regarding his personal life.
That maybe he wasn't only speaking about his personal life. That's
what he said during the press conference. He said rumors about myself. And that's not true. I will be the first one to admit that Sputnik sometimes opinion journalists like myself sometimes criticized Emmanuel Macron during the campaign, but that's one thing to criticize him, to give an opinion, and to say fake news, so-called fake news about himself, which is completely different.
Molly, what's it like for you in the States where this whole idea of fake news is such a big topic of conversation now? What are your thoughts about these comments, Emmanuel Macron slamming the Russian news agency Sputnik, calling it fake news?
I think Macron sort of discussing the role of Russian state-funded, quote, media organizations in the overall landscape of the changing media environment is really important. And I wish that there was more of it being done in the United States. In the US, there's a very disturbing trend now of the propaganda coming from RT and Sputnik being echoed into far-right media outlets in the US, into Breitbart and into InfoWars and to other outlets, and then being picked up by Fox News, which remains one of the most watched news outlets in the country. So the sort of bleed of utterly crap news from terrible sources, sometimes just completely made up, into real media that people rely on for information is having a devastating impact on how people view their own governments and the world, and it's something that needs to be looked at. I wish the American leadership would address it more directly as opposed to giving them accreditation in the White House. But certainly I am not the only one that feels this way, and I think that it is an issue that is not going to go away anytime soon.
Nadezhda, you wanted to weigh in?
Yes, because I am a real victim of Russian propaganda, and I would like to demonstrate this. Because after the Russia 24 accused me in espionage, I did not stop, and I applied to Russian court with the application against defamation, and I demanded to publish information that it's not true that I'm spy. And what happened? First of all, Russia 24 announced that they did not show this reportage. Billions of people in Russia saw that this reportage was shown, but Russia 24 said no, we did not demonstrate it, and they cancelled it from their official site. And the second point, the court admitted that it was a private opinion of journalists who did this reportage. The journalists the journalist thought that my activity was espionage, and she can write to express her opinion about this. So now we are preparing application for European Court, because journalists should check the information which is published. She can't accuse the people in things which is not truth. But it's exactly so. It is exactly the way to work today. Today they show something, and tomorrow they say, oh, we did not show this. That's all.
Dominique.
I think going back to the campaign, it's not a mystery that Mr. Macron was not the candidate from Moscow. and that there were other candidates, Mr. Fillon or Madame Le Pen, who were pushed by Moscow. But I think what's clearly shows is that President Putin, President of Russia, was the first to be invited in Paris, in Versailles, and so President Macron is now President of France. And he wants to show that this is history, and now we've got to work together.
Just, we've been talking a lot about all the negativity between France and Russia. Just going into this meeting, Russia's ambassador to France did say Moscow did have a positive perception of Mr. Macron. Let's listen.
I think that starting to clear this distrust, which has accumulated in recent years, is very important. And I think that this meeting will help to gain some ground.
The Russian ambassador to France, they're saying he believes that Russia does have a chance of moving forward with France, with President Emmanuel Macron. What that means exactly, we will see over the coming weeks and the months. Thank you so much to all of my guests for coming in and sharing this debate with me tonight. Thank you to Edouard Chanot, journalist for Sputnik, Nadezhda Kutapova, a human rights activist. Thank you so much. Dominique Trinquant, thank you so much for coming in to us, former advisor to Emmanuel Macron. And to you, Molly McHugh, a foreign policy consultant, speaking to us there from Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you. That wraps up tonight's debate. All right, sorry, we're just figuring out where we're going. Emma James is with us. Emma, lots of talk, I imagine, about Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron at Versailles in the media today for this Media Watch.
Very much so. This was hugely anticipated, not least because of one fairly frivolous reason, you might say. A lot of people wondering what the handshake would look like between Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron. Plantu, the cartoonist, has come up with this particular offering, which says, "I floored Trump with my arm of iron." Clearly they think that Emmanuel Macron has quite a weapon in his armoury, really, with that handshake. And it does seem silly to talk about it, but at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is known for being a strong man. And it is interesting to see how this young, relatively diplomatically inexperienced president is going to deal with him. Another cartoonist who was looking at this one is Alex, and as you see here, he's got Emmanuel Macron portrayed in a pair of shorts, which is rather unfortunate. And of course, sorry, the words for this one, "I floored Trump with my arm of iron." The Guardian newspaper, of course, drawing on the fact that Emmanuel Macron had said his handshake with Donald Trump was nothing spontaneous. This was planned, it was intentional. He describes it as a moment of truth. He said it's not the be-all and the end-all, but he wanted really to make his mark right from the offset and show that he's no pushover. So when people did see the handshake, some seemed a little bit disappointed. This person pointing out that it lasted just 7 seconds, and lots of people describing it as a rather perfunctory handshake. This journalist who was there says long awaited but rather unspectacular. However, there was a photograph taken inside which paints a rather different picture. It is just grabbing that one moment in time, but it is one that is being reproduced very, very widely in the media and on the internet because of that sort of look of doubt of Vladimir Putin as he's about to take the hand of Emmanuel Macron, who does have the face of a man who is issuing a challenge there, I think it's fair to say. Before this meeting took place, Politico posted this article on its website saying that after that white-knuckle handshake with Donald Trump, the young French leader is primed for more displays of muscular assertiveness. And of course, they point out that Putin's last visit in October 2016 was cancelled because of François Hollande saying that the bombing of Aleppo amounted to a war crime. So there were a lot of bridges that needed to be rebuilt here. And that's just one of the reasons, really, why this could have been a very testy affair. Human Rights Watch, too, were watching this with great interest because, as they point out, Emmanuel Macron has been very committed to the issue of human rights throughout his campaign to become president, and in his inaugural speech he said France will always make sure to be on the side of liberty and human rights, and they really wanted to keep a check on him, really, and see whether he kept to his word.
Emmanuel Macron taking a very strong stance on Russia, we heard in his comments after the meeting. What kind of reaction has there been to that?
Well, a lot of people really feel that he showed his mettle, that he stood up to a man who is very experienced and known to be very tough. There's one issue in particular that has a resonance here in France today, and lots of people are talking about it. This Twitter user talking about the fact that Macron urged Putin to tell the truth about arrests and persecution of gay men, in particular in Chechnya, where basically men are being put into concentration camps, they're being tortured, and there were a number of protests being seen online. People were posting this image of Vladimir Putin as a drag queen, which is actually banned in Russia. A court ruled that it was extremist literature. And there were protests around Paris too. Stop Homophobia in Chechnya, that's at the Trocadero near the Eiffel Tower. And here, just opposite where that meeting happened, people were placing banners that unfurled on the building opposite. And the reason that it's important today is this. France has just welcomed its very first gay refugee from Chechnya. Now, it does seem that Emmanuel Macron is very keen to make symbolic gestures. Huffington Post, the French version, says the sense of timing. And we've already seen quite a few symbolic gestures made by Emmanuel Macron. I think it's something that we're going to see continue throughout his presidency. But it's very interesting to see that this is really a focus online here today.
All right, Emma, thank you so much for that and that look at Media Watch. Emma James there, thanks to you as well for watching France 24. Do stay tuned. We will be back in just a few moments with more news.